do? My name is Superman.
Oh, boy, am I glad to see you. Tell me, when you're flying around, do you have cape trouble?
No, but then I've had
There is a specific kind of silence that falls when the person everyone expected never arrives. On July 1st, 1959, that silence filled a small chapel in Los Angeles. Inside, the man once loved by millions of children was being buried. Outside, Hollywood said nothing. What happened to George Reeves in the weeks before that? Nobody showed up to his funeral. The reason behind it will change how you think about fame forever. The tragic night of June 16th. The house at 1579 Benedict Canyon Drive was not a grand estate. It was a modest three-room home tucked into the Los Angeles hills. Nothing like the mansion you would expect for a man whose face was known to every child in America. But on the night of June 15th, turning into June 16th, 1959, something happened inside that small house that shook the country and has never been fully explained. The evening had started badly. George Reeves and his fiancée Leonore Lemon had dinner at a local restaurant where people at nearby tables heard them arguing. They came home and kept drinking. A writer named Robert Condon was staying in the guest room that night, working on the autobiography of heavyweight boxing champion Archie Moore. George had arranged a series of exhibition boxing matches with Moore scheduled for that summer. He had signed a new Superman contract for a planned series revival. He had $4,000 in traveler's checks sitting in a drawer purchased for the honeymoon. The wedding was planned for June 18th in Mexico. Around midnight, George excused himself and went to bed. He told Leonore he wanted an early start for boxing training the following morning. Downstairs, Lemon, Condon, and two guests who had arrived uninvited, a neighbor named Carol Van Ronkel and a man named William Bliss, sat and kept drinking. At around 1:20 in the morning, George came back downstairs in his bathrobe, irritated by the noise. An argument broke out between him and Bliss. Both men apologized. The group settled down together, and then, sometime around 1:45 in the morning, George stood up, said goodnight a second time, and climbed the stairs again. What happened next is the question at the center of everything. Before George had even reached the bedroom, Leonore Lemon said something out loud that has never been satisfactorily explained in the decades since. The official LAPD report filed by Sergeant V.A. Peterson, based on interviews with all four witnesses, records her words precisely. She said, "He is going to shoot himself." Then they heard a drawer open upstairs, and Lemon said again, "He is getting the gun out now, and he is going to shoot himself." Then a single gunshot came from the bedroom above. William Bliss ran up the stairs. He found George Reeves lying naked on his back across the bed, his bathrobe folded at the foot of it. A German Luger pistol lay on the floor near his feet. The bullet had entered his skull and traveled into the ceiling. George Reeves was 45 years old. His blood alcohol level was 0.27, more than 3 times the legal limit. Toxicology found narcotics in his system, almost certainly painkillers from a car accident 2 months earlier that had left him needing 27 stitches. Nobody called the police for somewhere between 45 minutes and several hours. When officers finally arrived at approximately 3 o'clock in the morning, all 4 witnesses in that house were extremely drunk. The LAPD looked at what they had: a gunshot, a troubled career, a drunk man in a difficult relationship, and concluded it was self-inflicted death. But when they looked more closely at that bedroom, the details they found did not slide cleanly into any simple story at all. Hollywood closed the case in weeks, but the people who knew George Reeves best were not finished. And the funeral that followed told its own devastating story about who he really was to the industry that made him famous. The funeral Hollywood forgot. 2 weeks passed between the gunshot and the funeral. 2 full weeks for Hollywood to organize itself. 2 weeks for castmates, studio executives, producers, and the powerful figures who had profited from George Reeves's fame to buy a plane ticket or drive across town and sit in a pew for an hour. When the chapel door opened on July 1st at the Wayside Chapel inside the Gates funeral home, the room was almost empty. His mother, Helen, was there. His attorney, Jerry Geisler, was there. A small number of personal friends filled the remaining seats. Not a single major Hollywood star attended. The co-stars from Adventures of Superman, the show he had anchored for 6 seasons and 104 episodes, were not publicly recorded as being present. The media barely registered the service. Reverend R. Parker Jones of St. Albans Episcopal Church spoke briefly about Reeves's love of children, his hospital visits, and his dedication to his fans. Then it was over. Superman was buried by a handful of people in near-complete silence. Helen Basolo stood at that funeral in a state of grief that had curdled entirely into fury. She did not believe her son had taken his own life, not for one moment, and she refused to accept the verdict from the instant she first heard it. She hired Jerry Geisler, one of the most celebrated defense attorneys in American history, a man who had represented Charlie Chaplin, Errol Flynn, Bugsy Siegel, and Marilyn Monroe. She authorized a second autopsy. She hired the Nick Harris Detective Agency of Los Angeles. She spent the remaining 5 years of her life fighting for an answer she never received. She told anyone who would listen, "I don't care about ceremony. I only want justice for George." The second autopsy found something the first had not noted: previously undocumented bruises on Reeves's forehead and chest that could indicate a physical struggle before the shooting. Despite this, Geisler withdrew from the case after approximately 1 month. He told the press he was satisfied with the self-inflicted death ruling, but multiple sources, including crime historian Troy Taylor, recorded that privately, Geisler warned Helen that very dangerous people were involved and strongly advised her to stop pursuing the investigation. Helen did not stop. She just never got what she needed. The absence of Hollywood at that funeral was not simple neglect. It was not merely the callousness of an industry that discards people the moment they become inconvenient. It was something more calculated and more frightening, because the circumstances surrounding George Reeves's death involved people with very long arms and very little tolerance for scrutiny. And Hollywood, which had spent decades watching what happened to people who crossed those people, knew exactly when to stay home and say nothing. Actor Rory Calhoun told a reporter plainly after the funeral, "No one in Hollywood believed the self-inflicted death story." Alan Ladd said the same. Gig Young said the same. They said it quietly, in private, in rooms where they felt reasonably safe. Because saying it on the record meant placing yourself in the sightline of a man who had already made one inconvenient woman disappear in a car accident and run a bleeding actress out of town on fabricated illegal substance charges. Hollywood did not need the math explained to it. The room was empty because people were afraid. And the reason they were afraid lies in the forensic details of that bedroom and in the identity of the people connected to George Reeves at the end of his life. The mystery that refused to die. The physical evidence inside that bedroom raised questions that investigators either could not or would not answer. The shell casing from the Luger was found underneath George Reeves's body on the bed. In a standard self-inflicted death, the casing is ejected away from the shooter by the force of the discharge. It should not be under the body. Gun expert Bob Shell explained that a .30 caliber Luger throws its casings to the right and rear at various angles. Critics of the self-inflicted death ruling asked how that casing ended up beneath a man who allegedly shot himself and then fell backwards onto it. Defenders argued that if he was seated on the bed's edge, the trajectory was physically possible. It was possible. It was not certain. The Luger had no fingerprints on it whatsoever. Not Reeves's prints, not anyone else's. The weapon was coated in a thick layer of fresh oil that had prevented any prints from adhering. No explanation was ever offered for why a man's own gun, in his own bedroom, had been freshly oiled in a way that happened to destroy all forensic evidence of who had touched it. 10 days after the death, investigators returned and pulled up the bedroom carpet. They found 2 additional bullet holes in the floor beneath it. One bullet had passed completely through the floor and lodged in the ceiling of the living room below. The other was recovered from a wooden beam. Both had been fired from the same Luger. All 4 witnesses had heard exactly 1 shot on the night George Reeves died. Lemon's explanation, relayed through a friend, was that she had fired the gun into the floor and ceiling weeks earlier as a casual test. Attorney Jerry Giesler called this, in his exact words, a bunch of hooey. Then there is the phone call that changes everything. At approximately 4:30 in the morning on June 16th, before any public announcement of Reeves's death had been made, before a single newspaper had printed a word, and before any radio station had broadcast anything whatsoever, Toni Mannix called actress Phyllis Coates, the original Lois Lane from Adventures of Superman. Coates later described the call in precise terms. She said Toni was hyperventilating and ranting, and Toni told her, "The boy is dead. He's been killed." Toni Mannix knew about the death before it was public knowledge. She called it tragedy before investigators had reached any conclusion whatsoever. There is no innocent explanation for this that anyone has ever been able to construct. 4 theories have circulated since 1959. The first is self-inflicted death, supported by Reeves's blood alcohol level, the narcotics, his career frustration, and the cumulative weight of a life that had given him everything and protected him from nothing. Producer Whitney Ellsworth believed the combination of alcohol and painkillers may have left George not fully knowing what he was doing in those final minutes. The second is accidental discharge. Estate executor Art Weissman, Reeves's closest friend, believed Reeves had a dark private habit when heavily intoxicated, pressing what he thought was an unloaded gun to his temple as a grim joke, a mock death performance he had done before. Lemon had witnessed it. Her prediction downstairs was therefore not a prediction at all, just weary recognition that he was doing the bit again. Weissman believed someone had, at an earlier point, replaced the blank with a live round. The dark joke became an execution. The third theory places Leonore Lemon directly in that bedroom. She predicted the shooting before it happened. She denied saying it within 24 hours. She broke the coroner's evidence seal and removed potential evidence from the room. The honeymoon travel funds were never recovered. And actor Fred Crane, who knew Reeves personally, reported that William Bliss had privately told a mutual friend something that nobody ever officially investigated, that Lemon was actually upstairs, not downstairs, when the shot was fired, and came down immediately afterwards saying, "Tell them I was down here. Tell them I was down here." The fourth theory involves a mob hit, arranged through Eddie Mannix's connections. Authors Sam Kashner and Nancy Schoenberger argued this directly in their book Hollywood Kryptonite. Schoenberger stated, "We came to the conclusion that George Reeves was the victim of a hit. When Reeves ended his affair with Toni Mannix, she became incensed and began stalking him. That harassment rose to the level of having him killed through her husband's mob connections." In 1999, a Beverly Hills publicist named Edward Lawsey, who rented space on Toni's property in her final years, claimed publicly that a bedridden Toni, in a moment of lucidity during late-stage Alzheimer's disease, confessed to a Catholic priest that she was responsible for having Reeves killed. Lawsey said she was terrified of dying without confession because she feared hells. Jack Larson disputed the claim. Toni's condition makes any confession legally worthless, but it has never been entirely dismissed either. Private investigator Milo Spiriglio, who worked the case for years and wrote about it, said plainly, "Nearly everyone in Hollywood has always been led to believe that George Reeves died by self-inflicted death. Not everyone believed it then, nor do they believe it now. I am one of those who does not." Researcher Jim Nolt offered the most honest summary. There is evidence to support self-inflicted death, evidence to support a tragic accident, and evidence to support killing. The only people who know how George Reeves died are no longer with us. To understand any of these theories fully, you have to understand the 2 women at the center of his life in those final years, and the man behind one of them who made Hollywood genuinely afraid. The 2 women who owned him. Eddie Mannix was not simply a powerful man. He was the kind of powerful man that erased people. Born in New Jersey in 1891, he spent his early years as a mob-connected bouncer before rising to general manager and vice president of MGM. Hollywood knew him by two names, the Bulldog and the Fixer. He covered up suspicious deaths, engineered forced abortions for unwed actresses, and hospitalized his own mistress 15 times before having the LAPD remove her from the city on fabricated illegal substance charges when she tried to sue him. When his first wife filed for divorce, citing abuse, she died in a single car crash outside Palm Springs. No investigation was conducted. This was the man whose wife fell in love with George Reeves. Toni Mannix had been a Ziegfeld Follies showgirl before she became Eddie's wife. She was generous, vivacious, powerful in her own right, and 8 years older than George Reeves. Their affair began around 1951 and lasted approximately 7 years. Eddie approved of the arrangement. As Jack Larson summarized, it got Toni off Eddie's back. Toni and Eddie bought George the house at 1579 Benedict Canyon Drive, the same house where he would later die. She bought him his Jaguar. She paid his bills during the long dry months between Superman filming seasons when the salary stopped. She clothed him, furnished his home, and covered everything he needed. One person close to the situation said simply, "Whatever George wanted, he got." Toni Mannix owned George Reeves, lock, stock, and barrel. George would visit the Mannix household freely. Eddie would sit, eating breakfast in his robe, while George let himself in through the back door, said hello, and helped himself to milk from the refrigerator. 3 people trapped in an arrangement that suited everyone just enough to keep it going. In late 1958, George met Leonore Lemon at a restaurant in New York City and ended things with Toni. The aftermath was terrifying in its intensity. Toni called his home 20 or more times daily. She parked across the street from his house and sat for hours watching the front door. His dog, a one-eyed schnauzer named Sam, whom George adored, disappeared from his car one day while he ran errands. Toni had keys to his vehicles. 3 automobile incidents nearly killed George in the 3 months before his death. On April 8, 1959, his Jaguar's brakes failed completely on Benedict Canyon Road and sent him into a rock face. He needed 27 stitches. A mechanic reportedly found a severed brake fluid line. No investigation was opened. Reeves filed a formal harassment complaint with the Beverly Hills Police Department, naming Toni Mannix directly. The DA investigation that followed discovered both Reeves and Toni were receiving threatening calls, suggesting Eddie himself may have been orchestrating the campaign through hired operatives to keep his own hands clean. Leonore Lemon was combative and volatile in her own way. She had reportedly been ejected from the Stork Club in 1941 for fist-fighting. She drank heavily. The relationship with Reeves was turbulent and loud. The engagement was real, but the peace was fragile. George Reeves was 45 years old, physically injured, financially stretched, and trapped between 2 women with very different reasons to want to control him and very little willingness to let go. To understand what broke this man, you also have to understand what he had given up just to get here. Because the Superman cape that trapped him was never something he chose freely in the first place. The man behind the cape. George Reeves joined the adventures of Superman in 1951, not because he was excited about wearing a cape. He told the Tampa Times with complete honesty that he said yes to Superman for 2 words. He was hungry. He had spent nearly a decade in Hollywood watching a real career refuse to materialize, and he had reached the point where he could not afford to say no to anything. He accepted. What he did not expect was that the role would produce something genuine in return. The children who watched Adventures of Superman did not simply enjoy the show. They believed it. They believed George Reeves could actually fly. They believed bullets genuinely bounced off his chest. Their letters arrived by the thousands. Their faces at hospital visits and public appearances were filled with a trust so complete and so innocent that it was almost painful to receive. George responded to that trust with everything he had. He quit smoking because he refused to let children see Superman with a cigarette. He refused to bring dates to public appearances because nothing should compromise the image. He visited sick children in hospitals who had been told specifically that Superman was coming to see them. He put a handmade sign on his dressing room door that read, "Honest George, the people's friend." The prop department updated it after he received an honorary Kentucky Colonel Commission on a publicity trip, and he wore the upgraded version with the same quiet warmth he brought to everything. Jack Larson, who played Jimmy Olsen across all 104 episodes, described him with visible affection. George would come around the side of a wall, blow a kiss, and say, "Don't worry, Super Boo's going to save you." He called himself Super Boo. Larson explained why so many of his own dramatic scenes show him fighting back a smile in moments of genuine peril. "I get asked why I'm masking a smile so much. Jimmy's in deadly danger, and I'm laughing. It's because George said something funny just as he breaks through the wall." Noel Neill, who played Lois Lane for 5 seasons, described him simply. "George was a gentle, kind-spirited guy. In between takes, he would look into the camera, lift up his glasses, and wink. He was our hero. But the very thing that made him beloved was quietly strangling everything else he wanted to be. His contract blocked him from taking roles that might conflict with the Superman image. His salary, which eventually reached around $5,000 per week, applied only to the roughly 8 weeks of filming per year. For the remaining 44 weeks, he earned nothing. He developed his own television series called Port of Entry, an adventure drama planned for Hawaii and Mexico, and wrote the pilot himself. When producers could not find a Superman replacement, they offered him more money, and Port of Entry was quietly buried. He never got to make it. He appeared in From Here to Eternity in 1953, the film that won Best Picture, in a supporting role that was solid and real. A popular story claims audiences recognized him as Superman, and his scenes were therefore cut. Biographer Jim Beaver researched this thoroughly and found it entirely false. The screenwriter, the director, and multiple cast members confirmed his role was always exactly what appeared in the final film. The legend exists because people could not understand how a man in that film could still fail to become a star. The explanation was simply that Hollywood had made up its mind about George Reeves and was not interested in reconsidering. The tragedy of George Reeves did not begin with a gunshot. It began much earlier, in a childhood shaped entirely by deception, long before Hollywood ever got its hands on him. A life built on lies. George Reeves was not born George Reeves. He was born George Kiefer Brewer on January 5, 1914, in Woolstock, Iowa. His mother, Helen, was 16 years old. His father, Donald Carl Brewer, was gone almost before the ink on the marriage certificate was dry. Helen took the baby and moved from Kentucky to Illinois to California, searching for stability that never quite arrived. She married Frank Besselo in Pasadena, and Frank formally adopted George in 1927. For a few years, it was the closest thing to an ordinary family George had ever known. Then Helen filed for divorce, and when George came home and asked where his stepfather had gone, Helen told him something devastating. Frank had killed himself. Frank Bessolo lived until 1944. He remarried. He built a separate life in plain view. He was breathing and present through the entirety of George's Hollywood years. Helen had invented a dead man because the truth required an uncomfortable conversation, and she let her son carry invented grief through his entire young adulthood. Even the birth date carved on his mausoleum plaque reads January 6th. He was born January 5th. His mother's lies followed him into eternity. George discovered the deception at Pasadena Junior College when he came across a photograph during spring house cleaning. He described it himself in an interview with the New York Sun. "My mother is a real pixie. I came across a picture of a good-looking guy, a big fellow, and idly asked who that was. Mother said, 'Oh, that's your father,' and then stopped dead when she realized what she'd said." He did not speak to Helen through most of the 1940s. The wound went that deep. Before the deception fully unraveled, before the broken relationship with his mother and the broken career and the broken promises, George had been genuinely gifted. He boxed in the Golden Gloves. He sang. He trained at the Pasadena Playhouse for 5 years and played Shakespeare. His mother allegedly paid a retired boxer to fight and injure him before a tournament to force him away from boxing and toward acting. His nose was broken 9 times. He pivoted to the stage and never looked back. Hollywood noticed. He was signed to Warner Brothers, who renamed him George Reeves. He appeared in Gone with the Wind in 1939, playing Stuart Tarleton in the famous opening porch scene. He appeared with James Cagney, with Ronald Reagan, and starred opposite Claudette Colbert in the 1943 war drama So Proudly We Hail. Director Mark Sandrich believed completely in his potential and signed him to a serious deal. The career finally seemed to be finding its shape. Then, Sandrich died of a heart attack in 1945, and everything changed. Reeves told Jack Larson years later, "If Mark Sandrich had not died, I would not be here in this monkey suit." The sadness in that sentence is immense. One man's death in 1945 sent another man into a cape in 1951. The industry he returned to after military service had no memory of him and no particular interest in building one. He took what came: low-budget serials, villain roles, westerns with recycled sets. At the lowest point of his life, he was digging cesspools for cash. Multiple sources confirm this without any softening. The man who would become Superman was shoveling sewage to keep a roof over his head. And when the Superman role finally arrived and the children believed in him completely, the world he had spent his whole life trying to reach was already deciding it had no room for him. The legacy that outlived everything. George Reeves received a posthumous star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame in 1960, 1 year after his death, at 6709 Hollywood Boulevard. DC Comics included him in a publication honoring the 50 greatest contributors to the Superman legacy in 1985. His cremated remains rest in a glassed-in niche at Mountain View Cemetery in Altadena, California. His mother is beside him in a second urn. The plaque reads January 6th as his birth date. He was born January 5th. His mother's original lie is still carved in stone above his ashes. The 2006 film Hollywoodland brought his story to a generation who had not grown up watching Adventures of Superman. Ben Affleck played Reeves, gaining 20 pounds for the role, wearing contact lenses and facial prosthetics, watching all 104 episodes to absorb his voice and bearing. He won the Best Actor prize at the Venice Film Festival. Diane Lane played Tony Mannix, Bob Hoskins played Eddie, and Robin Tunney played Leonore Lemon. The film presented 3 possible versions of what happened that night and committed to none of them, because the evidence genuinely does not support commitment to any single explanation. In 2023, a digitally recreated version of Reeves as Superman appeared in The Flash, in a multiverse sequence alongside several other deceased Superman actors. The film was released on June 16th, the 64th anniversary of his death. The backlash from fans was immediate and sharp. A man whose entire tragedy was rooted in being permanently locked into one identity against his will was digitally resurrected in that same identity without consent on the anniversary of the night he died. The controversy contributed directly to SAG-AFTRA strike discussions about digital actor recreations that began the following month. What is not disputed by anyone who ever knew him is what he gave. He quit smoking for children who never knew he had quit. He sat with sick kids in hospital rooms who had been told Superman was coming specifically to see them, and he sat there as long as they needed him to. He wore a costume he was privately embarrassed by, and wore it with more dignity than the industry that put him in it ever deserved. He told Jack Larson he did not know if he had any adult fans. He told a casting director he would never escape the role. He was right about all of it. Tell us in the comments which theory you believe, and whether you think George Reeves ever got the story he deserved.